The alarm did not wake Ethan so much as it assaulted him. A sharp, rhythmic pulse that cut through the dark room, demanding immediate attention. He reached out, his hand fumbling across the bedside table until his fingers found the cold glass of his phone. The screen flared to life, a harsh rectangle of light in the pre-dawn gloom. Before his eyes could even adjust, the notifications began to cascade. A red badge on his email app climbed from 10 to 20 in seconds. A news headline flashed across the lock screen, announcing yet another crisis halfway across the globe. He swiped to clear them, but more took their place. A relentless digital tide that refused to recede. He sat up, the weight of the day already pressing against his chest. Every ping was a command. Every vibration a reminder of a world that never paused for breath. He stood and walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Below, the streets were already beginning to churn with the morning rush. He took a breath, but the air felt thin, crowded by the sheer volume of tasks waiting for him. The cycle had begun again, and he was already running to keep pace. By 9, Ethan was behind his desk, the office hum a dull roar of keyboards and overlapping voices. He navigated the morning with a practiced efficiency. When a colleague stopped by to ask about his progress, Ethan offered the required smile. "I am doing fine," he said, the words sliding off his tongue with mechanical ease. He watched the colleague nod and walk away, the interaction leaving no trace of connection. Beneath the surface, the emptiness was not just a feeling. It was a physical weight, a hollow space behind his ribs that no amount of work could fill. He retreated to his office, closed the door, and locked it. He needed the ritual. He sat in his chair, bowed his head, and began the familiar sequence of words. "Lord, help me," he whispered. "Lord, fix this." The phrases felt brittle, like dry leaves. He waited for a sense of relief, for the familiar warmth of faith to settle the shaking in his hands. Nothing came. The prayers felt like stones dropped into a bottomless well, hitting nothing. He stood up, smoothed his tie, and opened the door to face the noise again. The office noise surged back the moment he opened his door. Phones ringing, printers churning, the constant thrum of air conditioning. It was a relentless, mechanical symphony. Ethan walked to the break room, seeking a moment of reprieve, but found only more chatter. He leaned against the cold tile of the wall, closing his eyes to carve out a sliver of space for his thoughts. "Lord, I do not know what to do," he murmured, the words barely escaping his lips. He waited. He held his breath, straining for a whisper, a sign, a shift in the air. But there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the distant, muffled sound of a colleague laughing in the hallway. The silence from God felt heavy, a physical barrier between him and the world he believed in. It was not the absence of sound that terrified him. It was the absence of presence. He opened his eyes, staring at the sterile white floor. The world continued its clamorous march, indifferent to his plea. He pushed off the wall, the weight in his chest doubling, and stepped back into the frantic, noisy current of the day. The drive home was a blur of brake lights and aggressive lane changes. Ethan pulled into his driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled in the dark. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, watching the house lights flicker. Inside, the silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, expectant. He moved to his bedroom, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He sat on the edge of the bed, the room dim, illuminated only by the sharp blue light of his phone screen. He tapped the icon for his Bible app. The screen glowed, displaying the verse of the day in crisp, clean font. He stared at the words, waiting for the familiar spark of recognition, but the text remained static, unmoving. A long, ragged sigh escaped him, vibrating in the quiet air. He tapped the screen to close the app, the darkness rushing back into the room to fill the void. "What is the point?" he whispered, his voice cracking against the stillness. "I pray, I believe, but nothing ever changes." The words hung in the air, cold and accusatory. A wave of heat flushed across his face, a sharp, stinging shame. He felt the weight in his chest harden into something solid. He dropped the phone onto the mattress, his hands trembling as he stared at the ceiling, trapped in the wreckage of his own faith. Sleep did not bring rest. It brought the room. A vast, windowless space, packed tight with thousands of faces, all moving, all speaking at once. The sound was not a conversation. It was a physical force. News anchors droned from unseen speakers, their voices overlapping into a jagged, rhythmic chant. Friends chattered about trivialities, strangers shouted warnings, and the air itself vibrated with the incessant, high-pitched ring of 1,000 digital notifications. Ethan stood in the center, the noise pressing against his skin like rising water. He tried to speak, to anchor himself with a prayer, but the moment his lips parted, the cacophony surged. The sound rose in a violent, screeching crescendo, a wall of static that swallowed his voice before it could even leave his throat. He clawed at the air, gasping for a breath of quiet, but there was no silence to be found. The vortex spun faster, the faces blurring into a singular spinning mask of indifference. He felt his lungs burning, his chest tightening under the weight of the sound. Then, he broke. He jolted upright, his back arching off the mattress. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The room was dark, the air still, but the phantom ringing of the dream continued to echo in his ears. The morning light offered no clarity, only the harsh reality of a collapsing schedule. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the monitor, as the final report for his primary project vanished into a sea of error messages. Months of labor, late nights, and focused effort had unraveled in a single, inexplicable system failure. He clicked the refresh button until his finger ached, but the screen remained blank. He pushed back from the desk, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contact list, looking for a familiar name. He typed a brief message to a close friend, a simple request for a moment to talk, and hit send. He watched the status bar crawl across the screen, waiting for the 3 dots that would signal a reply. They never appeared. The silence from the device was absolute, a digital void that mirrored the growing hollow in his chest. He stood and walked to the window, watching the city move below him with an indifference that felt like a physical blow. Every attempt to anchor himself to his previous life failed. He was a man adrift, watching his world dismantle itself piece by piece. The drive home was not a journey, it was a cage. Traffic ground to a complete shuddering halt, locking Ethan into an endless sea of metal. He sat with his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, watching the brake lights ahead pulse like a warning. The city was a pressure cooker. A horn blared to his left, long and jagged, triggering a chain reaction of angry, rhythmic honking that filled the air. In the distance, the piercing, high-frequency wail of a siren sliced through the smog, growing louder, then fading into the relentless hum of idling engines. Ethan leaned his head back, eyes squeezed shut, trying to carve out a sliver of space for his own mind. The air inside the car felt thin, recycled, and stagnant. He opened his mouth, his lips dry, and whispered into the dashboard, "God, if you are still there, I need you." He held his breath, waiting for a shift in the atmosphere, a sign, or even a momentary lull in the chaos. But the sirens only grew sharper. He waited until his lungs burned, but the only answer was the vibration of the engine beneath his feet and the suffocating indifferent roar of the gridlock. The city faded into a thin line of gray on the horizon as Ethan turned onto the gravel drive. Each crunch of stone beneath his tires sounded unnaturally loud, a sharp intrusion into the landscape. He killed the engine, and the sudden absence of the hum he had lived with for years felt like a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. He stepped out of the car. The air was still, thick, with the scent of pine and damp earth. He reached into his pocket, thumbing the edge of his phone, and pulled it out. No bars. The screen remained dark, a useless slab of glass. He walked toward the house, his boots heavy on the porch steps. The silence here was not empty. It was dense, almost heavy. as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. He stood at the threshold, waiting for the familiar ping of a notification, a vibration, anything to anchor him to the world he had just left. Nothing came. The quiet was absolute, an alien presence that made his skin prickle. The sun dipped toward the horizon, bleeding orange and purple across the sky. Ethan sat on the porch, his hands gripped tight around his knees. The silence between them had stretched thin, and he finally broke it. "Grandpa," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Did you ever feel like God stopped listening?" The old man did not answer immediately. He leaned forward, watching the ancient trees sway in the evening breeze, his face unreadable. Ethan shifted, the wood of the porch creaking beneath him, waiting for a comfort that felt miles away. Finally, the grandfather turned his head. "No," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But I often felt like I stopped listening." Ethan frowned, the confusion etched into his brow. "What do you mean?" The grandfather gestured toward the vast empty fields surrounding them. "God rarely shouts, Ethan. And this world, it never stops screaming." The words hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the quiet landscape, then back at his grandfather, the weight of the statement settling into his chest. The light died without warning. One moment, the room was bathed in the warm amber glow of the lamp. The next, it was swallowed by a darkness so absolute it felt solid. Ethan blinked, his eyes straining against the void. He reached for his phone, his thumb swiping across the screen, but the device remained cold and unresponsive. No signal, no light, no digital tether to the world outside. A sharp, jagged spike of panic flared in his chest, a reflexive urge to check the time, to see a notification, to confirm he still existed in the flow of things. He stood up, his foot catching the edge of the rug, and he stumbled. The house was silent. Not the quiet of a pause, but the heavy, crushing silence of a tomb. He held his breath, listening for the hum of the refrigerator or the distant buzz of a transformer, but there was nothing. The modern world had simply ceased to exist within these walls. He felt the floorboards beneath his feet, the cool air against his skin, and the sudden, terrifying realization that he was entirely alone with his own thoughts. There was no screen to scroll, no email to answer, no noise to hide behind. The stillness was no longer a concept. It was a physical weight pressing against him. The candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Ethan sat motionless, but his mind was a riot. Without the constant ping of notifications or the scroll of a feed, the dam broke. Worries he had buried under layers of productivity surged to the surface. He saw the project that had unraveled, the strained relationships he had ignored, and the hollow exhaustion he had masked with practiced smiles. Every regret he had suppressed for years demanded attention. He tried to reach for a distraction, a mental habit of shifting focus, but there was nowhere to turn. The silence of the room acted like a mirror, reflecting the clutter of his own soul back at him. It was sharp, painful, and relentless. He gripped the edge of the wooden chair, his knuckles white, waiting for the familiar panic to peak and shatter him. But as the minutes ticked by, the intensity of the rush began to ebb. The frantic, jagged edges of his thoughts started to smooth out. The clamor did not vanish, but it softened, receding into a manageable hum. In that vacuum, he finally felt the terrifying, beautiful weight of his own presence. The room was still. The only sound, the soft, rhythmic popping of the candle wick. Ethan looked at the table where his grandfather's Bible rested, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. He reached out, his fingers tracing the spine before he opened it. He did not search for a specific passage. He simply let the pages fall where they would. His eyes landed on the words, "Be still and know that I am God." He read them once, then again, the ink stark against the yellowed paper. For years, these words had been a distant theological concept, a line to be recited in times of trouble. Now, in the absolute silence of the house, they felt different. They felt heavy. They felt like a direct, physical command aimed squarely at his chest. The words did not just sit on the page. They seemed to vibrate in the air around him. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to unravel, not because his problems had vanished, but because the perspective had shifted. The noise of his life suddenly seemed small. It was no longer a verse to be studied. It was an invitation to stop running. He closed his eyes, the words echoing in the quiet, and for the first time, he understood. Ethan bowed his head, his hands resting on the cool wood of the table. The familiar urge to rattle off a list of grievances and demands rose in his throat, a reflex honed by years of frantic surface-level prayer. He started to speak. "Lord, fix the project. Lord, ease the pressure." But the words died in the air. They felt thin. They felt like noise. He stopped, the silence of the room pressing in, demanding something more substantial. He took a breath, feeling the air fill his lungs, and let the old, transactional prayers fall away. He did not ask for the deadlines to vanish, or for the chaos of his life to be erased. Instead, he leaned into the emptiness. "God," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I do not know how to hear you anymore. I have filled every corner of my life with static. I have spent my days running from the quiet because I was terrified of what I might find." He paused, the honesty of the admission leaving him exposed. "If you are speaking, please, teach me how to listen, not to the noise, but to you." He did not look for a sign. He did not wait for a booming answer. He simply sat there, his hands open, his heart stripped of its usual defenses, waiting in the stillness for the first time in his life. Ethan kept his eyes closed, waiting for the air to shift, for a sign to break the stillness of the room. He braced himself for a voice, a vision, or some sudden, miraculous clearing of his path. Nothing happened. The candle continued to burn with a steady, unwavering flame. The wind outside remained absent. He opened his eyes, scanning the dark corners of the room, expecting the weight of his life to return the moment he moved. But the crushing pressure in his chest was gone. It had not been replaced by a surge of adrenaline or a sudden burst of clarity, but by something far more profound, a quiet, immovable anchor. He felt the rhythm of his own breathing, slow and deliberate, syncing with the stillness of the house. The problems he had brought with him were still there, yet they no longer felt like a rising tide threatening to drown him. They were merely waves, and he was the shore. He did not need the world to stop screaming to know he was held. He was finally, truly listening. Ethan opened his eyes before the first digital chime could cut through the room. The air felt different. It was cool, still, and held a clarity he had not known in years. He lay motionless, watching the soft, gray light of dawn crawl across the ceiling. His hand twitched toward the nightstand, a reflex to check for missed messages, but he pulled it back. He let the silence sit. Outside, the world was waking, but the frantic, jagged edges of his usual morning anxiety were absent. He sat up, the floorboards cool beneath his feet, and looked out the window. The trees stood motionless against the pale sky. It was a simple, quiet scene, yet it carried a weight of truth that stopped him cold. He had spent months, perhaps years, convinced that the silence he heard in his prayers was a sign of abandonment. He had blamed the heavens for being distant. Now, in the stillness of this room, the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. God had never gone silent. God had never moved. He had simply been living in a state of constant, deafening static. The noise was not in the world. It was in him. The dawn was not bringing a new God. It was revealing the one who had been there through every storm. The city greeted him with its usual, jagged intensity. Deadlines stacked up like falling dominoes, and the relentless ping of incoming messages resumed their familiar, frantic rhythm. Stress returned as a constant companion, but the internal landscape had fundamentally shifted. Ethan began to carve out small, sacred pockets of silence within the chaos. He started with 5 minutes of stillness before his first meeting, sitting in his chair while the world outside his window raced by. He walked to the subway without his headphones, letting the ambient noise of the city exist without needing to drown it out. At first, these pauses felt like a waste of time, a dangerous indulgence in a world that demanded constant output. He felt the urge to reach for his phone, to fill the void with scrolling, to reclaim the lost productivity. But he held the silence. He let the minutes pass, unburdened by tasks or digital demands. Slowly, these moments stopped feeling like a retreat and started feeling like a necessity. They became anchors, solid and immovable, dropped into the middle of his turbulent day. He learned that the silence was not an absence of life, but the very thing that allowed him to endure it. The world did not stop demanding. Problems remained, stubborn and unresolved, like stones in a riverbed. A project he had carefully built hit a wall, and a door he had hoped would open stayed firmly shut. In the past, these moments would have triggered a cascade of panic, a frantic search for a fix, and a hollow feeling of being abandoned. But this time, the reaction was different. He stood in the middle of his office, the air thick with the tension of a failed deadline, and felt the familiar urge to scramble. He took a breath. He felt the weight of the situation, the reality of the loss. But the panic did not take root. Instead, a quiet strength rose up to meet the pressure. It was not a magical solution that erased the difficulty, nor a sudden clarity that explained the why. It was something more profound. It was an abiding, steady peace that anchored his soul even as the storm raged around him. He realized that the silence he had once feared was actually a foundation. He could stand in the center of the chaos, fully aware of the damage, yet completely unmoved in his core. The office remained a space of sharp edges and urgent demands. Phones rang, keyboards clattered, and the air hummed with the friction of unfinished tasks. Amidst this, Ethan moved with a deliberate, measured pace. He was reviewing a report when a colleague stopped by his desk, eyes wide with the strain of a mounting deadline. The colleague looked at the stack of files, then at Ethan, and frowned. "How do you stay so calm with everything going on?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the ambient noise of the room. Ethan looked up, his hands resting flat on the desk. He felt the weight of his own unresolved projects, the reality of the challenges still sitting on his plate. He did not offer a platitude or a quick fix. He simply smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "I still have problems," he admitted, his voice steady and clear against the background chatter. "But I do not face them alone anymore." The colleague stared for a moment, the tension in their shoulders dropping just a fraction. Ethan turned back to his work, the chaos of the office still swirling around him, but the isolation that had once defined his struggle was gone. The city outside his window hummed with its usual frantic energy, but inside, the room held a different quality of air. Ethan moved through the evening with intention, setting aside the digital noise that once dictated his pace. He understood now that the silence was not a void to be filled, but a space to be inhabited. He walked to his bedside, the surface clear of clutter. He took a small piece of paper and a pen. His hand moved slowly, deliberate in every stroke. He wrote the words, the ink dark against the white surface, capturing the resolve that had taken root in his soul. He taped the note to the wall, right where his eyes would land the moment he woke. The weight of the world remained, but his perspective had shifted. He turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle, and for the first time, he simply breathed.